So this beautiful seaside town behind me is Whitehaven on the western coast of Cumbria, up in the English northwestern region. And it's a place of very beautiful seaside buildings and a rare undersea mining history. But it's also the only place that the United States of America ever attempted to attack on mainland Britain. Believe it or not, Whitehaven, this is the place the US tried to invade. The year was 1778 and Britain was at war with its American colonies, who 2 years earlier had declared independence. It was a bitterly fought conflict between one of the world's largest imperial powers and poorly armed but passionate colonists led by some of history's most charismatic leaders. While the war on the American mainland was the obvious centre of conflict, out at sea the war was increasingly important. British naval blockades attempted to stifle trade and arms arriving to the colonies, and raids were often launched against coastal military sites from the sea. When war broke out in 1775, the colonists had no official navy force, while the British were the preeminent naval power of the age. Many American leaders at first argued that establishing a navy and challenging the British was a waste of time. However, George Washington, John Adams and others thought that even a small navy could prove enough of a thorn in the side of the British to deal them a great inconvenience. And so they set up the Continental Navy, which had some successes against the British, mostly blockading ports and harassing British fleets in motion. Of the handful of early naval officers given command of vessels was one John Paul Jones, who had earned the rank through experience alone and was himself British. Now, John Paul Jones is one of those characters in history with incredible life stories. He was born in Kirkcudbright in the south of Scotland in 1747 and began his maritime career aged just 13 here in Whitehaven when he was an apprentice on a merchant ship called the Friendship. He'd advanced up the ranks over the years on various trade voyages, but at the age of just 21 he found himself in charge of a brig called John, when both the captain and ranking mate were struck down with yellow fever. John Paul's success getting the brig back to port earned him his own captaincy. However, John Paul developed a reputation for cruel and unnecessary behaviour as a captain. In 1770, over a dispute about wages, John Paul had one of the men flogged, and he died later of his injuries. The man had been the son of an influential Scottish family, and so when John Paul was released on bail back on shore, he was encouraged to leave and never come back. He left for London, but a couple of years later killed another crew member over another dispute over wages, and fled to Virginia to start again, adopting a new surname of Jones. John Paul Jones then quickly became a patriot to the new American cause, and signed up to join the budding Continental Navy. He was one of few commanders who found success, capturing numerous merchant vessels around Nova Scotia. So Jones was eventually given command of a smaller sloop called the USS Ranger, and given the very vague orders of going out to sea and assisting the American cause in whatever way possible. Now, ordinarily that meant going out and seizing more merchant ships or harassing more British naval vessels, but John Paul Jones had already shown himself to be a bit of a maverick, and he had other things in mind. He was going to take the war right to Britain itself. With a crew of about 140, Jones was to journey to France carrying news of the war. On the way back, however, Jones decided to sail to the familiar port of Whitehaven and teach the British a lesson. Whitehaven at the time was the second largest port in Britain in terms of tobacco imports, and had already become industrialised thanks to its large coal industry. But it was also a little out of the way, and Jones knew the British simply wouldn't be expecting any raids. And he was right. Now, on the 23rd of April 1778, the USS Ranger anchored just out there off the coast of Whitehaven, hidden by the darkness of night. Now, with 30 volunteers over 2 longboats, John Paul Jones began his midnight raid. So Jones ordered one of the boats to go set fire to ships down in a harbour over there, while the boat he commanded was to take over the fort, which was just down here, and he managed to do that quite easily by scaling the wall and finding the entire garrison fast asleep in their beds. Now, after taking over the fort, Jones ordered his men to spike all the cannons around here, which basically meant driving a long nail into the hole used to light the cannons, which basically rendered them useless. Now, by the time Jones had left the fort, he expected to see the entire harbour ablaze, but there'd been a problem. The men on that first boat had trouble finding a flame. The lantern on their little boat had gone out, and so they searched the entire town looking for fire. In the end, they ended up popping into a local tavern, where of course they started drinking. Eventually, Jones rallied his men together and they set about lighting a large boat, the Thompson, carrying coal, hoping that the flames would spread to other ships and set the entire harbour of 200 and odd boats ablaze. The raiders then retreated back to the Ranger, confident that they had had a great success. However, locals waking in the morning had been alerted to the danger. Quickly, the fire aboard the first boat was extinguished. Furious, Jones sailed north in the hope of kidnapping Lord Selkirk, but instead found only his pregnant wife, who handed over a small amount of silver and a tea set. Severely disappointed, Jones narrowly avoided a mutiny, but did manage to salvage something from the journey when he successfully attacked the British ship Drake in the Irish Sea and forced its surrender. Despite the botched raid on Whitehaven, Jones was hailed a hero throughout countries hostile to Britain, including France and the Netherlands. After all, he had proved that the British were vulnerable to attack on their own shores. Something no one, including the British, thought was true. As a result, the raid on Whitehaven actually did the British a favour. It caused such an uproar in England that naval defences were strengthened around the entire coast of Britain, making future raids by enemies such as France incredibly difficult. Now, one thing I'm struggling to wrap my head around is the sheer audacity of Jones to bring the war across the Atlantic Ocean to the British mainland, and just the impacts that would have had, the shock horror. The only equivalent I can think of is, say, in the modern age, when, say, the US invaded Iraq in 2003, some lone Iraqi fighter jet decided to fly across halfway around the world and bomb some farm in the middle of Idaho or something, and before flying back and being hailed a hero. Can you imagine the media circus? Can you imagine the uproar that would have happened because of that? Well, that's exactly the same situation of Jones raiding Whitehaven, successful or not. After the raid, Jones was depicted in Britain as a pirate, whereas in the US he was hailed as a hero. And even today he's considered one of the grandfathers of the US Navy, which is quite a legacy. And that is the incredible story of the time a buccaneering Scottish maverick invaded England, and the only time in history the US has ever attacked the British mainland. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.
I went down to camp along with Captain Good, and there we saw the men and boys as thick as 60 pudding. Yankee Doodle, keep it up, Yankee Doodle dandy. Find the music and the step and with